Hello and welcome to Hare in the Hawthorn. I'm Kate Ray and I'm your host, and I have the lovely Neil Rushton with me hosting as always. It's nice to have him back after a long break. And those of you who've seen the pinned post, hopefully it's at the top of the page, will have a flavour of the things that we're hoping to see and hoping to discover over this new season of Hare in the Hawthorn, which we talk about broadly the world of the paranormal, but with a fairy perspective, and trying to bring a lot of threads together that we believe are kind of intertwined. And in this particular one, we're talking about a subject matter that's come to us both from the same source, if you like. And it's been a weird journey, and the journey is the journey of the gnomes. There's one sat right behind me just here. He's become my little mascot. I bought him for my dog, but he's now sat on top of my chair. So gnomes is not normally something that I would be drawn to, or although I have had an encounter of an earth elemental and earth spirit that I called a gnome. We'll get into bits and bobs of that later on. But there's one specific story that drew sort of me and Neil together with the gnomes, or the gnomes drew us together. And that's the story of the Wollaton Gnomes, which I'll explain later about why that's particularly close to me now. And Neil's just going to give us a brief introduction to the Wollaton Gnomes and what the case is all about and why it's a big thing within fairy evidence. So over to you, Neil.
Yeah, well, the Wollaton Gnomes, we're going to talk about the new book that's just come out, edited by, oh, there you go, we both have our coffees. We are both authors in said book, which is edited by Simon Young. And it's all of the evidence from what I'm about to describe. I'll describe sort of basically what happened, and then later we'll go into, you know, why it's still an important anecdotal bit of evidence and what we're doing to, you know, to further the cause of understanding it, kind of thing. But I thought I'd just to really get across what happened in a couple of paragraphs, I thought I'd read from my own recent article partly about the Wollaton Gnomes on my blog site, Dead But Dreaming. So it's from an article called what's the article called? Fairies, Children and Altered States of Consciousness. And that's not quite the same as the article that went into the book, but it's more or less there as the same thing. So for anyone who doesn't know, here's a couple of paragraphs from my latest piece talking about, you know, just introducing what the Wollaton Gnomes are all about. So one of the most bizarre modern fairy encounters happened at Wollaton Park in Nottingham on the 23rd of September 1979. It includes various traditional folkloric fairy motifs, but is overlain with some strange and anomalous features which give it an edge of authenticity, especially as it was reported by a group of 7 children between 8 and 10 years of age, who stuck rigorously to their story even when separated and questioned by their headmaster. The consistency of their testimonies is particularly impressive despite some of the aberrant qualities of the account. Their testimonies were recorded on tape by the headmaster a few days after the event, and the transcriptions are recorded for posterity by Simon Young, and those transcriptions are in the new Wollaton Gnomes book. So the incident happened during the early evening at twilight. The children were playing close to a fenced-off marshy area in the park with ponds. Without warning, there appeared about 30 small cars, each containing 2 gnome-like creatures. That is, they had bobbled nightcaps, beards, wrinkly skin, and dressed in coloured jerkins. One of the older children described them as about half the size of me, and they had long white beards with red at the bottom, and they had little white and red cars, and they were chasing us. The cars were silent and seemed able to defy the laws of physics by floating over logs on the ground. Although the gnomic cars chased the children, they were consistently described as being friendly, and the whole encounter seemed like a game, with the gnomes laughing, although when the 2 youngest children fell over in the marsh, they became frightened. One of the only discrepancies in the testimonies is that the 5 children said the gnomes were, apart from laughing, consistently silent throughout, whereas 2 children described them as talking in some type of foreign language. The cars were described as having triangular lights and some sort of button instead of a steering wheel. After about 15 minutes, soon after the 2 youngsters fell in the marsh, the children ran off and the gnomes disappeared back into the trees. So that's, you know, that's it in a nutshell. That's what happened in 1979 with those children. And as I insinuated there, their transcripts, they were separated. You can imagine what the headmaster was like in 1979, you know, bit of a disciplinarian. Right, we're going to separate you lot, get your stories off you, which he did. And their correlation is quite unusual, I would think, for a bunch of 8, 9, 10 years old kids. You know, if they were having a bit of a jape and trying to fool people, I don't think it quite worked out like that once they were separated. So that basic story is what's set in train to where we are now, and like you can talk about in a moment. But it's always, from the first time I heard it years and years ago, I thought, that's strange, that's quite odd, because although it does contain some of those motifs and the sorts of things that we are sometimes used to in any type of fairy encounter, the uniqueness of it makes it very interesting, you know, especially the cars, the fact they could float, the potentially strange language that these creatures were talking, and the way that they intermixed with the children. Although do notice, and this might be important to what we go on to, the encounter only consists of sound and vision. There's no tactility there. They don't touch the cars, they don't touch the gnomes. Everything is about seeing and hearing. So I think that might be an important element that we could maybe flesh out a little bit later on. So definitely. That's basically the story of the Wollaton Gnomes. I
think, like you, when you said about the head teacher, I come from education background. I've worked in education for many years, teacher by trade. And I know that when you separate, especially children of that age, one of them will crack. One of them will say, it's a joke, you know, I don't want to get into trouble, I don't want to be seen as mad. But they didn't. I mean, there was slight discrepancies in how they described what they saw, but I mean, that's something that the book goes into quite in detail about why that may happen and why that occurs, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. But other than that, they were very consistent. I heard this story, I think I was about the same age as them. You know, I remember being in primary school when I heard this story, and for me it has an extra oomph because I'm a Nottinghamshire lass, you know, by birth. And so hearing this story, you know, that was just up the road from me at Wollaton Park, I remember thinking, you're right, what a bunch of numpties. As a kid, I genuinely had no belief in what they were saying. For me, it just sounded far too far-fetched. It wasn't until I revisited this story recently when we had the lovely Dan Green talking to us about it, and then you know, the work that we've done with Simon Young on the book, that I've just been blown away about, you know, really thinking about the details of it and the elements of it. There are so many different facets of exploration for this particular story. It's wide open. It is wide open, and I've stopped thinking, what a bunch of numpties, to, you know, if somebody please come forward and say, you know, I am that person who was involved, or I know those kids, I was in their class, or as Simon Young said when he's put out calls for people to come forward, he said, you know, it will be completely anonymous. We understand that people don't really want to have names attached when they get a little older. One of the themes that we pick up in the book is that interaction, specifically with children and the Fae realm. What's your perspective on that? You know, why is it that it seems a large proportion of these interactions, or recorded proportion, are children?
Well, yes and no, I'd say to that. Certainly, again, the article, my article in the book goes into this a little bit. And from my understanding, actually, certainly in modern times, say the 21st century, even back into the late 20th century, back to the date we're talking about with the Wollaton Gnomes, most encounters recorded with the fairies are actually by adults.
Right.
And most of the children encounters are recorded by adults from when they were children.
Yes.
So you very rarely, this is another thing that makes the Wollaton story even more special. You rarely get anything, certainly in the folklore, and not very often in modern fairy encounter anecdotes. You will not get the children telling their own story. It will be so and so who's remembering something that happened 20 years ago. So actually, although we have this idea, and I think it is a legitimate idea, that children will be more open to the fairies' existence or the existence of non-human intelligent entities, they'll just be more open to it, and therefore potentially more likely to see the fairies. Well, you know, why we think of children playing with fairies and then they outgrow it and they don't see it anymore. That doesn't necessarily mean what they were interacting with as children doesn't exist anymore.
I think another. Sorry, Neil, go on.
But that's, if you look at, say, something like the Fairy Investigation Society, the survey that came out a few years ago, there, I can't remember the exact percentage, but it's probably about 10% children's anecdotes. And again, it's all from an adult perspective, so you have to filter out all of those memory issues that are going to happen with any kind of incidents, let alone a kind of supernatural incident. But the other thing I just wanted to mention was, out of those reports, such as in the survey and other reports, those, although they're ranging around 10%, many of those 10% from children will often describe the fairies they see as gnomes.
Wow.
So there is some kind of cultural coding. Again, we'll talk about that in a moment, that is allowing children or people recording a childhood experience as a kind of gnome experience, very specific, that they're talking about gnomes, even if you want to say, well, gnomes and fairies are the same thing. But it's just an interesting thing to note in the modern encounter experiences. Yeah,
that is very interesting. And talking about the adult encounters, this particular case, we see in Marjorie T. Johnston's Seeing Fairies book that there are two other encounters within Wollaton that are gnome specific. One of them is cited, I think, as before the children had their encounter. I couldn't sort of pin down a date on that, where a woman was taken on an extraordinary sensory exploration of very mundane things within the park, from a feather to leaves, etc. By the gnomes. She was led around the park and shown them in a different light, and she you know, she was obviously an adult. There was another one with a lady from the 1900s, I think it was cited as, again, she had a gnome encounter. Getting back to this word gnome, so let's try and sort of really pinpoint what that is. What does gnome mean to you? What's the word gnome mean to you?
No one's ever asked me that question before, Kate. That's a good one. What does the word gnome mean to you? Well, as now, I'm prepared to be corrected on the etymology of the word gnome. I'm sure there's someone out there that's going to say, no. There was an example 300 years before what you're about to tell us. But as far as I'm aware, if he didn't invent the word, he popularized it in culture. And the guy I'm talking about is Paracelsus, who was a 16th century, well, he was a lot of things. He was a medic, he was a philosopher, a theologian. So he was a bit of a polymath, but he wrote a book so we're talking about early to mid 16th century, which described the elementals. and he coded the elemental creatures which he suggested were fundamental to the environment in the continuance health of the environment. And he kind of his terms changed sometimes, but he basically pinned down 4 different types of what he always called elementals. And they were the salamander of the fire, they were the sylph of the air, the undine of the water, and the gnome of the earth. And he describes gnomes as obviously you're talking about 16th century language, but he's basically talking about immaterial, non-physical beings which will do a certain job for the propagation of the environment. And gnomes, very specifically, were retaining the health of the soil and working with minerals and stones in, usually portrayed as being underground. That's the genesis of the term gnome, but it's not really until the 19th century that you start seeing the images that we connect as being gnomes. The typical thing, the bobbly hat, the big white beards, the short stature. Yeah, go on, just look behind you, and there's your typical gnome. And it's very difficult to get a handle on how that kind of artistic representation started happening at that time. And I get the feeling that a lot of it started on the continent, because a lot of these early picture sources are German.
Yes.
And somehow gnomes became associated with Christmas. So you get Christmas cards with gnomes on right from the middle of the 19th century. So there you go. You've got the kind of esoteric origination of the term, and that's kind of way of thinking the metaphysics of what these entities may or may not be. The Paracelsus was outlining. Then you get the popularization of gnomes in the 19th century, alongside fairies, which fairies suddenly became winged Tinkerbells. Well, didn't become Tinkerbell to the 20th century, but you know what I mean. So that they were popularized, but it's also important to mention that Paracelsus's ideas were picked up almost, forget about the popularization, they were picked up almost directly by the Theosophist movement. And so you've got people like Rudolf Steiner using Paracelsus's taxonomy of the fairy types and sort of reintroducing it to Theosophist thinking. Which is, well, how do you pin that down? It's a kind of philosophical idealism, but it's intrinsically important that there is a non-material, metaphysical in its true sense, metaphysical world, and these elementals, again, going along with Paracelsus, that they're essential for the propagation of the environment, and someone like Steiner and his compatriots in the Theosophist movement went along with that coding of sylph, undine, salamander, and your gnome. So that's sort of a brief rush through history of why we're talking about gnomes and why we think a gnome looks like that. Whether you want to get into the sort of bigger discussion of is a gnome a fairy? What's the difference between a fairy and a gnome? I would say very briefly, not very much. That's actually probably a bigger discussion than we've got time for today. But it's a very interesting one, something that I'm really kind of starting to focus in on now. The taxonomies of these different entities. Are they the same thing, or have we just coded them through various cultural motifs like the Christmas cards or whatever?
I think the other thing is, as well, for me, is when I started this channel, one of the questions that I had in my mind and still do have in my mind is I find it very hard to see the elementals in the sense of the true fae. For me, elementals are slightly separate. Elementals, I spoke about in the book, are more like egregores, that they were birthed into the world with purpose. And although they may inhabit similar realms and have become sentient beings within those realms, I mean, again, this could be a completely different sort of subject, and maybe we should, discuss it and explore it in a bit more detail. But there is a blurring of boundaries through the like you say, through the cultural aspect of what they are now. I think one of the things, going back to why I find gnomes difficult, is because of this kind of look and the kind of almost cartoonish persona that they have. They seem to be more sort of caricatures than most other of the Fey realm of these little sort of jolly, old men who dodder around, etc. And I find that very, very difficult. I'll speak very, very briefly about my very first physical encounter, and I have said before about, and it will be below in one of the videos, where I met what I first turned a gnome, and then renamed a sod, because gnome didn't quite fit because of this cultural image that we have of gnomes. But the thing that I saw very much looked like it was part of the landscape. It didn't have bright colours for me. Something, and a fae that works with the earth and works with soil and plants and alabaster and marble, etc., would, to me, look like it lived in that element. And I don't know where the whole bright colours came from. Maybe they had again another massive discussion, but did they take on an almost a gargoyle type sense of protecting gardens, and being brightly clothed would sort of repulse other fae? I don't know, but again, massive subject. Getting back to the Wollaton gnomes, though, I'm trying to be so mindful of time with these segments at the moment, but so we kind of joined forces under Simon Young to write the book, which is available at Amazon. I think that's the only outlet from it at the moment, so please go out and buy it, because I mean, the writers, I was so overwhelmed to be included with some fantastic writers like yourself, Neil, in that. So that was the seed for us. And talking to Dan Green, which again is in one of the videos below, about the Wollaton Gnomes, and about this revival of interest that seems to be snowballing in my life, as I'm sure it is yours. Where do we go now with this? What are the questions that spring to your mind about the case? Where are the gaps, do you think?
Well, it's I mean, the group that you've initiated, along with Simon, obviously getting the people together for this book, and now we form this, what should we call it, a gnomic group?
The Gnome Collective.
The Gnome Collective. All right, this Gnome Collective. You've thrown me now. the Gnome Collective. What I like about this book, and the private correspondence that I've had with various of the people who've written for the book, is people are coming at this from lots of different perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
From almost like we've got a historian, a dowser,
Mm-hmm.
Forteans, fairyists, whatever you want to call us, all coming from those slightly different perspectives, which always helps if you're looking at any subject matter. If you've got a lot of people who are genuinely engaged at an intellectual level to look at it, then you're probably going to get a little bit closer to the truth.
Mm-hmm.
My own special interest is, were those children in some form of altered state of consciousness
Mm-hmm.
on that evening, and was that partly the reason why an incident like that happened?
Mm-hmm.
I'm still pretty sure that has something to do with it.
Yeah.
And I'm also pretty sure that the incident did happen, because there will always be. I mean, even at the time of the incident, I've seen a few newspaper cuttings, and it's, oh, away with the fairies. It's just all a big joke. But partly because what we've just talked about, the nature of the incident, um, uh, and what happened afterwards. Something happened. Those children experienced something. I'm pretty sure of that. However you want to describe that in terms of their state of consciousness. What's been interesting reading some of the articles, especially Simon's, actually, never taking anything for granted and not thinking, oh, well, isn't this a lovely story, and it all must be true, and the children saw the gnomes. No, let's have a bit of forensic investigation as much as you can without any of the children known to us at the moment. And I think that's what the book does, and hopefully the Gnome Collective will push this a little bit further, maybe. And once we finally all manage to hook up together, in real life, not in Zoom life, but in real life, and maybe even visit Wollaton Park, and I think that will help shed even more light on the truths, the untruths, the maybes, the whatabouteries. We'll just get a little. It will help having that number of really good investigative researchers on board. Will help just tell us it's a little bit closer to the story. But the only thing I don't expect is for the whole thing to be shown to be nonsense.
Yes.
Even if one of the children was found and came forward and said, oh no, we made it all up. Well, I'm at 40 years distance. Well, you might have other reasons for saying that. So the whole holy grail thing of sort of finding the children, it would be good, definitely, but be careful with the psychological implications of interviewing something about an incident, well-known incident like this, 40 plus years later. So if you really want to get into other people's, there's 10 essays in this book about the Wollaton Gnomes, apart from all the raw data that go to make up the incidents. And I was fascinated reading the others, how they've come to, I didn't think of that. I didn't really think of, the sound impacts of the occasion, or the fact that actually it was probably darker than has ever been reported. It was actually after twilight, and that brings other implications into it. But we're only finding this stuff out because they've got so many good people sort of putting themselves together and trying to dig a bit deeper into this fascinating.
I mean, the mental state of the kids for me is definitely a fascinating one, and I know it's definitely on your radar. But you've snuck into a country park after hours. In 1979, these kids under who were junior school kids, and they're out until they reckon they got home about 10 o'clock. I can't imagine being that age and not getting an ass whooping for being home that late. So it's kind of, how naughty were they being by breaking and entering, trespass, and being out really, really late on a school night, because it was a Sunday night. And that's got to really heighten the senses as well, of we're doing something that's a bit wrong. They did actually say, some of the kids said that they'd seen briefly the gnomes the summer holiday before, sort of scattered around. So but they didn't even mention that they were going there to find the gnomes. They were just going into the park and doing what kids do.
Their testimonies don't give that impression. They were just they were being a bit naughty. It was I mean, goodness, Kate, when I was 9 and 10, I'd be doing that all the time. But as you say, I got due punishment by my father when I returned. But I can well believe they're doing it. But back to your original point, is that if you're scared, a bit nervous, anxious, those things will alter your state of consciousness. Put in a semi-dark, gloomy, gloaming atmosphere, and I think there's, you could definitely look at this as being predicated, the incident being predicated on those children having altered their states of consciousness because of what they were doing and the environment they were in.
Definitely. I mean, the other aspect that there's so many aspects of this that fascinate me, and we are going to have further guests on who have written for this book in the very near future, and I'm sure it'll be something that we'll discuss later down the line. But one of the things that fascinates me about the Fey realm completely is I have a real belief that, as many do, that the Fae will present themselves in a way that you find acceptable. So the whole folly about these things looking like, the atypical gnomes could have been that they presented themselves in that atypical manner, so the kids had a real clear understanding of what they were and what they were about. There is, however, something underlying about this. And if there's any ufologists out there, anybody who understands the sort of the alien culture, there is something slightly kind of alien-y about it as well. The fact that they were in these almost hovering cars that left no tracks. One of the kids had gone back in the daylight to double check that whether there were tracks there, or whether there was evidence of these gnomes being there. Or could it have been that the gnomes just thought, you know what, we've seen these kids in noddy cars before, these kind of cars, and we're going to replicate that, but actually we want them floating, so that, I mean, that's another element to this. There's one more real kind of, for me, of a very sort of intriguing aspect is the, and I speak about it in my essay in the book, but the aspect that Nottingham is well known for its caves, and caves that were worked and inhabited, that were dug out of the sandstone. And it's not just Nottingham city centre, it's outwards as well. So if you're ever going to get a place where gnomes are dwelling, I think, could the energy of those people living in those properties and working, underground, and doing everyday jobs underground, these weren't, mining or just mining, although it's a big mining community. Did that kind of energy attract these gnomes in? Are these gnomes particularly attracted to Wollaton because of the sprawling gardens? And it's hugely architecturally laid out, the gardens. It's it's a manor house. So there's so many questions to sort of dig and delve into that. It's fascinating. I've gone from thinking what a load of tosh to really excited about delving into this case a bit deeper. And the other thing I want to say is, if anybody lives in Nottingham, I know I have family members, hi mum, who watch this channel, but if anybody knows any other experiences that have taken place within that vicinity, it doesn't have to be Wollaton, but it could be surrounding areas within Nottinghamshire where people have seen specifically had gnome encounters, we'd be really interested to find out and to sort of track down and see. I mean, Marjorie T. Johnson says in her book about, I think she calls them an ancient fairy clan, an ancient gnome clan that live in Wollaton.
That's right, yeah.
And that just, you can imagine these things being really tribalistic, and sort of dancing around little fires, and that's my imagination. But if anybody in that area has heard anything or knows somebody or themselves has had an experience with gnomes, it would just be brilliant to hear from you and see what your experiences have been. I'm super excited about this. I think the gnomes are going to take us on a real jolly jaunt around the Fey realms, in perhaps a way that I wouldn't have imagined, sort of looking at the Fey world. And I had a question yesterday. I did a podcast. I was interviewed on a podcast, and there were two things, actually. This will fascinate you, Neil. I was asked how fairies travel. So can they travel over long distances? And I was asked, do I think that they travel on the mycelium network of mushrooms? That just was like, that's genius. Can you imagine them using it as a subway, as an energetic subway?
Well, yeah, no, that's fascinating. That's actually, I've heard that before.
Have you?
That suggestion. I'm trying to think where I heard it before. It was something to do with me having a conversation with someone about Merlin Sheldrake's book,
yes,
about the mycelium network, and which is absolutely excellent. But
it's a brilliant book, brilliant.
But it's pretty straight down the line, biochemistry. It's not it's just showing you how there's a what does he call it, the wood wide web.
The Wood Wide Web, yeah.
Where this mycelium covers enormous areas of ground, and everything really is connected. Now, considering what we were talking about, altered states of consciousness and the role that certain mushrooms can have in altered state of consciousness, I'm starting to just sort of piece a few things together, just thinking, okay, it's pretty esoteric that you're locking them into a material network like the mycelium network, but maybe that's how they incorporate into our existence, if the consciousness of the person observing is correct. I don't know, I'm thinking off the top of my head here,
Yeah,
but
me
it's just
too.
you coming off that with that idea, that is genuinely interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that we do see gnomes on Christmas cards. I mean, we know the Fly Agaric association with Christmas. Again, that's another chat.
Yes.
But gnomes with the Fly Agaric, it seems to be a recurring theme as well. So if you talk about mycelium as a network of energy, and they communicate through sort of electronic pulses that go down to give information not only to the fungi fruit, but to other trees and plants that are around. Do fairies use that energy as a form of communication and a form of energetic pathways? I mean, can they go outside their own country or an area that are the Wollaton gnomes contained to Wollaton, or can they just bugger off on holiday to, maybe rock up in Barbados or whatever?
Well, yeah, well, maybe, but my idea is that locality thing is utterly dependent on the human consciousness that's interacting with them.
Yeah.
So if you were to suddenly replace all the people in Nottingham and around Wollaton Gnome, I'm not suggesting that this should be done, lovely place, Nottingham, but if you were to replace them with the same amount of people from another place with different ideas and different cultures, would the Wollaton Gnomes still exist? I think maybe not. I think this is completely culturally coded. It's real, but there's a cultural coding to it in how we and our individual consciousnesses are able to interact with whatever these entities are.
Definitely. I think I'm now going into the realm of caffeine fueled madness with these ideas, and I think we are sort of time up. I am being as strict as I possibly can be about these timings, and before I go into extreme realms about gnomes sunbathing on a beach in Barbados, which is an image that will stay with me for quite some time now. This is a subject matter we are so going to visit again, and again take themes from it about how the Fae present themselves, and the cultural coding of how Fae present themselves. I think is definitely a one that we can sit down and sort of chew over between us. I think we'll probably see in this next series a lot more of that as well, of me and Neil sort of discussing finer matters. And again, if anybody's got any questions or queries or ideas that they want to add to any of our new series, then please drop us a comment below, and we'll try and incorporate them. So I'm going to let you get off, Neil. Thank you so much for sitting with me again. I don't know why you do it. You must be mad.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
To come back for a new season and indulge me. I think the way I've described it is I'm the rambling one, and Neil's the one who grounds me with the academia, which I find lovely. No, it's true. It's true. So check out Neil's blog, Dead But Dreaming. Neil also has books on Amazon. You can look up his name. I'm going to do your plug here, Neil. And we've also got, I'm going to say it one more time, the Wollaton Gnomes, which is a Nottingham fairy mystery, and that can be found on Amazon, so please go and buy it. We don't, however, get any cash from this. We're all more than happy to partake in this because it's an interest. So I'm not plugging it for my own bank balance there. I'm plugging it because it's something we're all passionate about. And without further ado, I'm going to stop rambling. So thank you very much, guys, and till the next one, have a great day.
See you all soon.